walked into a really traditional internal medicine practice, inpatient, outpatient. I was involved with the hospital.
Time out. Time out. We have a lot of young listeners. What is a traditional internal medicine practice?
Right. I forget when I'm talking with a peer, you know exactly what I mean,
I
but
do.
there was a time pre 1996 where we had no hospitals.
Hello, and welcome to the Fire Chief Podcast, the only podcast dedicated to the Chief Medical Officer. I'm your host, Lee Scheinbart, and this podcast brings you stories and wisdom from the best CMOs in healthcare. These leaders face the toughest challenges in healthcare right now, and they will share with you their insights about how they do that. Today, our guest is Dr. Doug Koekkoek, most recently the Chief Physician Executive at Peace Health in Vancouver, Washington, and before that, the System Chief Medical Officer of the Physician Enterprise at Providence St. Joseph in Renton, Washington. Dr. K was born in Southern California but grew up in Eugene, Oregon, and attended the University of Oregon. Dr. K later earned his medical degree at the Oregon Health and Sciences University in Portland and trained in internal medicine at Providence Portland Medical Center. Currently, Dr. K is taking a pause in his physician executive career and finding other activities that suit his skills and motivations. Doug, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Lee. I'm pleased to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
You're quite welcome. Did I get your last name pronounced correctly?
It's been pronounced a lot of different ways. It's pronounced Koekkoek, so you were close, close enough.
I wanted to recognize that I screwed that up and let the public know that right out of the gate. So that's cool. Well, we'll refer to you as Doug, since we do know each other, and we'll go from there. And in fact, you and I do have a few things in common that we should share with our listeners. First, we have both provided some written material for a couple of books on chief medical officers, namely Dr. Mark Olsick's Essential Guidebook for the CMO, as well as Dr. Hoffman's book entitled So You Want to Be a CMO, Now What? And second, in addition to those two fine men, I believe we have several other mutual friends. And one in particular that I'm thinking of is Sean Gregory.
Yeah, right. Sean and I worked together at the Peace Health Southwest Medical Center.
And as you mentioned earlier, when I was at Health First, that's when Sean and I got to know each other when he was a CEO at our main hospital here. So it's a small world, and he's a good man, and now he's off himself doing another career. Are you still in touch with him?
Yeah, from time to time. That's right. He's out of healthcare. So,
Yep.
yeah, complete transition.
That's the nature of what we do, and that's a reality that we all face. And another thing we have in common, and perhaps maybe it's the most important to me and to the very nature of this podcast, is that we both, you and I, and we were just chatting about that, chose to step back from our executive roles and looked around at the proverbial, now what? What's next? I was fully retired a few years ago, and I found my way into some activities that have really filled my bucket. One of those is this podcast, and the other is teaching aspiring physician leaders about the role of the chief medical officer. I think you mentioned you're doing some mentoring and doing some things and paying it forward. Um, Tell us a little bit about that real quick.
Yeah, thanks, Lee. Yeah, I took the opportunity of a reorganization at Peace Health to step away from the formal leadership role. And so it's afforded me some time to do some writing, some individual mentorship, helping some peers with some physician leadership programs. So it's definitely a different pace. I'm not sure that I'll be doing this sort of work forever and whether I'll step into a more formal leadership role down the road. But for now, it's nice to be in a little bit of a slowdown mode.
Yeah, that I can understand. And paying it forward is something of real value to the people that are on the receiving end of that, right? I mean, you and I both had mentors at some point, but it wasn't necessarily a coordinated effort that people were stepping back on purpose to help others advance in their career. So I'm very appreciative of what you're doing, and we can relate on that level. So let's step back in time, what was your original plan when you chose to attend medical school? What were you thinking would happen?
Yeah, thanks for sending that question ahead of time because it allowed me to sort of reminisce a little bit and think about it because it is different and it's fascinating how life throws you some curves. But I was fortunate when I was an undergraduate. There was a really terrific physician mentorship program at the undergraduate level. I got to work with a plastic and reconstructive surgeon really closely. Went into the OR with him, scrubbed in on cases with him, things that you don't really see undergraduates getting an
Right.
opportunity to do any longer. But that really shaped me, and I think when I started medical school, I was sort of headed towards some sort of surgical specialty. But then, third year clerkships happened, and I stepped into a medicine rotation with just some terrific teachers, uh, with so much academic rigor. I mean, they looked at the differential diagnosis almost like a detective game, and
Mm.
compassionate, and like I said, terrific teachers, and that just really got a hold of me. And so I ended up saying, well, internal medicine is what I'm going to do, and so there was that big shift, kind of the middle of medical school, not exactly where I thought I was going to be, but enjoying it immensely.
Yeah, yeah. My wife had a great uncle who was a physician in a very, very small rural town, and his favorite saying is, "There's two kinds of doctors in the world: cutters and thinkers, and you better be able to think as fast as you can cut." So you turned into a thinker and went away from the scalpel. Good for you.
Wow.
As you became connected to the world of internal medicine and that differential diagnosis and the detective work, how did your career unfold after your training to ultimately get you into an executive position? What was that all about?
Yeah, I think it probably started. I took a year as chief resident, so you get an opportunity there to be involved with quality and process improvement, and leading a group of learning physicians. At that point, I think that whet my appetite a little bit. Um, from there, though, I stepped into a really traditional internal medicine practice, inpatient, outpatient. I was involved with the hospital.
Time
With
out. Time out. We have a lot of young listeners. What is a traditional internal medicine practice?
Right, I I forget when I'm talking with a peer. You know exactly what I
I
mean, but
do.
there was a time, pre-1996, where we had no hospitalists. I guess it was Bob Wachter who coined that term, and I
Hmm.
think that was 96, 98, something like that. And
Hmm.
and now, of course, no hospital operates without hospitalists who are basically your internists in the hospital. But prior to the mid 90s, you had traditional internal medicine doctors who did all the inpatient stuff, so they'd round on their patients, go back to the office, see outpatients, go back middle of the day, after hours, and do internal medicine in the hospital. And so that's what I stepped into. But again, at the time, there was no such thing as hospitalists. Um,
That's right. That's right. I remember those days, and I remember the first fellow who raised his hand at where I was, who said, "You know, I'd really like to try this inpatient role all the time." And we just it was such a change of thinking, and now you stated it, we don't really have hospitals without them. So when
It
you
was it was a fascinating time, right?
yeah, yeah.
When we were building hospital medicine programs. I mean, that was sort of a little bit of my calling too. As I had a hospital executive tap me on the shoulder and say, "Could you build a hospital medicine program?" So I stepped away from my internal medicine practice, hired some people, and um, stepped into that 7 days on, 7 days off. And I got to tell you, my wife kept looking at me like, "Well, why are you around all the time now on this week off?" And but I think I
She didn't
utilized.
sign up for that gig, and that's the gig she
Right.
got.
Yeah, but I utilized some of that week off to do some quality improvement stuff. And again,
Yeah,
that's a little bit of this journey into leadership. You know, you and I chatted before the recording that sometimes if you just are involved, people continue to tap you. Well, could you do this for me? And so, my journey, was starting the hospital medicine programs, and well, could you be our hospital epidemiologist, and could you run our quality committee? And then, you know, at some point I'd amassed enough things that I was really functioning as the CMO for the facility. And again, even that term was kind of new back in the early 90s.
Yeah. Yeah. So thank you for taking us, and I apologize for the timeout, but I might do it again on this show. Is
Okay.
taking us from, that traditional postgraduate period of life into these different areas where you could improve how things were running, if you will, whether it's an inpatient style program or quality and safety programs. Um, at what point did you begin to develop some intentionality and do some self preparation, not so much about the nuances of quality or the nuances of medical staff committee work, but leadership training? Tell us a little bit about what you did to begin to learn about that.
Yeah. I think a big piece of that was some of my personal mentors, those folks that said, hey, at that point I was with Providence. So we had, it was over 40 hospitals at that time. And the chief medical officers would get together. And so they were a terrific group of individuals to rub elbows with. And each of them were on sort of this professional journey. And so I learned something from them. But honestly, it wasn't a formal, I didn't do an MBA program. I did a physician executive leadership program through the Health Management Academy. I did the Intermountain ATP program with Brent James. I did some coursework with the Institute for Healthcare Improvement. So I had collected together some areas, frankly, that would be complementary to where I needed some work and more development, and could flesh out some of my experience. Um, yeah, so it was a bit piecemeal. I think that's different than most of the CMOs I work with today. I think they've had a little more intentionality to it, and a lot of them have been through a formal CMO training course or a MHA or an MBA program along that journey.
Would you, if you could, get in that proverbial time machine and go back and ask your younger self or talk to your younger self about how this future would unfold? Would you have changed any of it? You seem quite comfortable with what you've learned and how you um, began to adapt into different leadership styles and different roles? Or would you have said, go get your MBA or go sign up for some full on program?
Well, at the time, a lot of those things weren't as available as they are today, so it's hard to step back in time. Um, I think the value of having a strong cohort, whether it's through an MBA or an MHA program or a CMO training course like AAPL does, is you develop that camaraderie with a tight knit cohort group, and and I developed that with some fellow CMOs, but I think that's a piece that's a huge benefit that maybe I didn't have initially. So I might have done that differently. Um, I think the other issue that as I think back, how long you stay clinically active was always a question. And, working as a hospitalist, which I did transition into doing more hospital medicine work, made that easier because you could pick up a few shifts here or work one
Yes.
a week. Um, but staying clinically active, I think, I now wish I look longingly back at the time when I was clinically active, and I think it's been just a little too long now. I'd have to do a mini residency to step back into my clinical work, but um, that's a piece that if I could rewrite, I might have tried to figure out a way to carve more clinical activity longer into my leadership journey.
This question bubbles up all of the time when I go and talk with CMOs around the country and in our academy class and other gatherings. The question comes up whether someone should or should not remain in the clinical realm while rising into a physician executive role. And it's like politics. It's all local. It's what is it for you, your system, your role? Are you in a clinic? Are you in an FQHC? Are you in a hospital? But one thing that I do make clear to the younger folks, and I'm curious what you think about this, is if it's being forced upon you to pay for your salary, um, that is a complete false premise because they're subsidizing you anyway. So if you're a full-time hospitalist, you are being subsidized because your professional billings do not cover your salary. Plain and simple, we won't get into the finances. So even if you're working as a quarter or half FTE, you're not paying for anything. They're paying for you. There's no value add. And so I think what they don't want to do is, quote, pay you the full amount on the administrative side. So it becomes a little bit of an accounting shell game. I hope I haven't lost anyone here, but what do you think about this?
Yeah, I think in your administrative role as a chief medical officer, you bring incredible value. You may not generate RVUs, but when you make the hospital more efficient, you make throughput better, you make the OR schedule work more smoothly, you're bringing tremendous value. So I agree with you. I think you need to push back a little bit, and you're not just running meetings, you're not just managing bad behavior. You're really adding value, at least in the CMO roles as they're fashioned today.
Agreed. Agreed.
Both
Yes.
of them have so much operational influence. Um, yeah, so when I think about the clinical activity, it's much more about, is it scratching that itch of it's part of your personality, it's part of
Right.
why you did all the work to go through medical school. So there's that professional satisfaction for being able to see patients and the cloud with your peers that I still use the EMR just like you do. I know
Yep.
it's slow, I know the extra clip, so there's those pieces of value to you in your leadership role more so than you expect the hospital to gain value from that.
Yeah, another time we'll talk about my own shallow opinion about shared pain. Yeah, I want to be just as frustrated as you are in the EHR today, and we'll share this pain. And I won't be able to accomplish the things you really want me to do because we're going to sit here in pain. But that's just me spouting off at you. So we'll move on past that. Our listeners will benefit to hear about some of the wisdom that you've acquired, and you and I have prepped a little bit for this. So one of the first things I want to ask you about is at the regional and system level, especially since you're on the West Coast of the United States, you've seen your share of organizing labor activity, and you've been in the unique position of mentoring some frontline leaders through some of the initial response steps. And it's active today, and I have a buddy in Portland who is on the front lines as well. So share with our listeners some of the initial steps you have mentored people about as this groundswell of new thinking has entered our healthcare systems.
Yeah, it is a prominent part of the landscape that every administrative leader is going to deal with, I think. And so understanding organized labor is important. I guess I would start with, my position on this is if you get to a strike, we've all failed. Strikes are not good for patient care. You're delaying non-emergent care. You're sometimes dealing with replacement staff, so it's not good for the patients. It's clearly expensive for the hospital, influences potentially their quality and their brand. It's not good for the hospital, and even for nurses or technical staff that might be involved in a strike. While they may gain some benefits or salary, it's a tremendous strain on them as well. They're stepping away for income for the period of time during the strike. They risk sometimes, if the strike goes on long enough, losing some of their benefits and just what you sacrifice in the camaraderie of the team. Healthcare is a team sport, and there's enough bruised feelings and hurt in a strike. So anyway, all that to say, if you get to a strike, I think it's almost like a failure. And again, I'm not so naive to think that you sometimes won't get there, and it happens. Um, but I guess my challenge always to healthcare administrators is to really work hard to try and prevent that. And what does that look like? I think it starts with frontline managers who are really dedicated to talking with their staff, understanding sort of their concerns and worrying, and just addressing those proactively, not waiting till the end of the bargaining cycle before you start bringing those forward. Just, really good managers, I think, are probably the best mitigation to organized labor ending up in sort of a tense negotiation or strike. Um, uh, After that, just starting early and being proactive, and for the health systems to, you know, address their needs, be market competitive in the salary, and try and sort of step into that early use of mediators, all those things. Again, anything you can do to get away from the strike. But
Yeah,
yeah,
go ahead.
go ahead.
Sorry, Doug.
No,
Um,
go ahead. No.
when I was in a multi-specialty group of over 100 doctors, and I know you have served as a leader in a medical group, we had our own practice, so we were all owners and partners, and we entered into negotiations with insurance companies, local and national, hospital systems, other services that we wanted to expand into. And one of the things that my CEO at the time, and I was on the board, it was a management board, it wasn't as much a governance board, and he said, the strength is in the herd. So you gather all the doctors, and it is like, herding cats. But if you get all the cats in one room and you have a herd, people will pay attention. He says, however, there's one thing that most herd leaders don't understand, and that is never, ever bluff. So if you do organize as a group of physicians or physicians and nurses and so on and so forth, as you state so eloquently, be prepared for the sacrifices that you personally will make, your colleagues will make, the staff will make, the patients will endure. Because once you go down that road, it's inevitable where you're going to end up, which is at two different sides of a terrible table that nobody wants really to be at. But,
Mhm.
we inherit a lot of these problems. We didn't create them, but we inherited them. And my heart goes out to people who feel that organizing is their only opportunity to get to the table. And I applaud managers and leaders who can mitigate that or mediate that before it gets too far. But you can't bluff. And once you have organized, your life will never be the same again. And to the extent that you think that unionization will give you what you want, in fact, in the long term, you just have a voice at the table. You still have contracts, you still have negotiation, you still have renegotiation, and fundamentally, all you've gained is your voice. So if you're willing to do it, don't bluff and do it, and then come back to the table and deal with it honorably and move on. That I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
No, I think that's well said. Um, yeah, but again, I try and get people to sort of that organized labor is a fairly blunt tool for really developing that teamwork that we need, and it just sometimes is a wedge between good communication and proactive problem solving. So if if you can address grievances and concerns and questions outside of that, you're always going to be better off.
Yeah, yeah, and maybe it's less of a failure because I don't want people to feel any worse than they already feel. These are difficult situations, but maybe it's a symptom of a disease that it's a genetic defect, a structural flaw in the structure of healthcare, the way it has evolved. And as we talked earlier about classic internal medicine to hospitalists, things evolve. And then sometimes the law of unintended consequences is this is where we end up. So, very good advice that I will share to our listeners. So, um, one of the areas that I know you're very passionate about is approaching um, the lack of professionalism or poor professional behavior amongst physicians, and something you've spent some time thinking about. And it's very mysterious to a lot of our younger leaders. How do you deal with a physician who is employed and a member of the medical staff and is having trouble or is observed to have trouble in their professional behavior. And so, how would you begin to break that down and organize an approach, um, say to the chief of staff or the medical staff president, as well as the CMO? How do you begin to deal with some of that?
Yeah, this is a complicated area that most hospitals that have a mixed model, and by that I mean they have some employed physicians and some independent private practice doctors who are on medical staff, they'll struggle with this. I mean, the medical staff side has usually within your bylaws and credentialing and peer review policies a pretty well worked out process for dealing with clinical concerns and behavior concerns. Um, and so you can always use the medical staff side. But in these employed groups, you have another vehicle for managing behavior or clinical concerns, frankly. And so you sometimes have medical groups managing that as well. And so the controversy I think that comes up is, well, what can you share and who should be on point for which? Um, and On the clinical side, let's start there before we talk about maybe disruptive behavior. But on the clinical side, if the medical group has set up its own peer review committee that's chartered, that meets regularly, that keeps minutes, there can be a sharing of information from the hospital peer review committee and the medical group peer review committee without sacrificing the confidentiality of those documents.
Do you
Um,
need a sharing of information agreement between those two entities to do that?
Yeah, I think it's best if you do. I think the attorneys in the room will argue that back and forth. But I think if you want it bulletproof, you have a chartered committee on both sides, and then on both document sides. So on the medical staff side, with your privileging, you sign that you're going to share quality improvement and peer review information with the medical group. And then in the employment contract on the medical group side, to again say you're obligated to report if you're not in good standing with the medical staff and you're willing to let us share that information. So if it's in both the privileging documents and then the employment agreement, then it makes it really easy to share that information.
Yes, agreed, agreed. I don't want somebody to suddenly start sending information without knowing how to have that preparation.
Well, as I've managed a number of hospital CMOs, this is one of the first things I ask them to do. I say, now go back and read your hospital bylaws, credentialing, peer review policies. Make sure you understand those well, and then go to your medical group and ask them for their boilerplate and their contract, and read through that and make sure that you know that well. And
Good
um,
advice.
that that should be kind of day two on the job, maybe for the new CMO to make sure what the landscape looks
Right.
like. The other bit of advice, and again, not to throw this all off on the attorneys, but boy, you oughta when you're stepping into the new CMO job, get to know your hospital attorney. I can't tell you how many times they have saved me from a world of you know concerns and potential legal risk by just involving them early,
Yeah.
and they're there to help you. And so make sure that you know your medical staff attorney, and they should be on speed dial for sure.
So that's great information and practical and useful about that you can create a structure of sharing that will allow you to use one path over another or together in parallel. And that depends on the nuances of what the issues were. But one of the things that I think we indicated in our last exchange was that some of our non-clinical administrative partners, oftentimes our bosses or our bosses' colleagues, really want to weed out the bad apple through that HR employed side, or sometimes pressure the medical executive committee and their subcommittees to take an action. Y- tell us what you think about whether weeding out the bad apple is what does that mean, and why is that not a wise strategy?
Yeah, I think if you look at the history of peer review in our hospitals, I think that more punitive orientation of we're going to find someone who made a mistake and then we're going to punish them by removing privileges or kicking them off staff. Um, that doesn't serve anyone very well. Again, when you think about all the time that we've invested in a physician, their undergraduate, their medical school, their residency training, and you think about the lack of access and the shortage of physicians, it's a precious commodity. And so our our orientation should be, how do we preserve these careers? How do we give people additional training if there's a clinical gap? How do we give them some behavior modification or coaching if there's a professional conduct problem? Because the goal should be preserving the practitioner, not necessarily weeding them out. The caveat here is that, I mean, there's a place for weeding out maybe the bad practitioner, but that belongs maybe at the very front. When you're accepting somebody on the medical staff, do a really good job up front to make sure they have the right training and skills to be on your medical staff. Um, and maybe that's where the door is. Once they're on the medical staff, our orientation should be, how do we preserve this career? How do we increase their training where necessary?
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I do think that, and I didn't know this lesson until later in my career. I too felt some pressure to activate quickly on people who were deemed bad actors, if you will, whether it was their clinical skill or their behavior. But when done well, more often than not, there will be autocorrection and or things that can be done to help correct them. And sometimes it is as simple as taking stuff off their plate. I have found that, like you and I indicated, people would tap us on the shoulder and say, "Hey, Doug, would you like to take on this program? Would you like to build this?" And at some point, that's more than anybody can bear or should bear. And some of the bad professional behavior, although I didn't quite see it at the time, in the folks that I worked with, they had too much on their plate and just were not the kind of person to say no. And when then reorienting them, if you will, they come back better than ever. Like, just stop doing this and this, just do this, right? And it's not punitive. It is not derogatory. We're not firing you. We just want you to have some fresh air in your daily experience, and a little oxygen in front of you will go a long way. And I agree with you there that there are ways. And besides, you mentioned the word commodity. One of the triggering things for me is when our other peers in our health systems think of physicians as commodities. A commodity is something anybody can get, can be bought and sold on the open market. There ain't no such thing as commoditization of skilled clinical workers, physicians or otherwise. And we saw that with the pandemic. There is no such thing. And so you better actually put time and energy into helping people recover what they can do, even if it's a fraction of what they used to do, rather than get rid of them, because you're going to regret the decisions more often than not. That when you start treating the doctors like commodities, they quickly become martyrs, which quickly people rally around, and you find yourself on two sides of that discussion table, and maybe one of them goes off to collective bargaining, and you're left stuck. So there are definitely processes around. And of course, in a case of an imminent threat to patient safety, you always have suspension or whatever your bylaws allow. So there are definitely ways to manage this accordingly. Any other examples or nuances that come to mind that you want to talk about?
The other thing I would put out there is that I think the process of peer review is by and large not well understood by the general medical staff. There's a small circle of folks on the medical executive committee and on the peer review committee that understands how it works, how cases get there. And I think it is that lack of awareness and understanding of the process that sometimes leads to some of the fear and how people act out. So, and again, another bit of advice for the up and coming CMO is to make sure that you regularly get out in front of the medical staff and say, look, we're all subject to peer review. We have these automatic triggers that bring cases up. We also have cases that come to us from complaints. We have a multidisciplinary peer review committee that tries to look at these in an unbiased way, and we will get you that information afterwards, after your case is reviewed. But I think to a lot of doctors, it feels like it's this work happening in this black box on the side and, this cigar filled room. Like, who's doing this work and why are they doing it? And so, anyway, one more little piece to making this all run well is having a good understanding of what peer review is, why we do it, and how we have to be, as professionals, accountable to looking at the quality of our work. So anyway, there's that piece out there as well.
You know, I'm gonna piggyback on this. If I could wave the magic wand, either on the conditions of participation or joint commission, whoever created the term peer review, I want that term to die. And it was, I think, Mary Hoppe from the Greeley Corporation that shared with me, this is not peer review, it's performance improvement. Your performance is at X and we want it to be X plus Y or X plus Y plus A plus B. We just want to improve what you're doing. We are not, because peer review becomes that secret room with the cigar smoke and that guy's terrible. Why? Because I said so, because where I trained, that's not helpful in terms of managing physician ability. So that would be my first wish if I had that magic wand. And the other thing, which is probably impossible, but I can't tell you how many times I'm sitting at a credentials committee meeting and people are flipping through, back in the day when we had it on paper, not digital, and they're looking at the file, they're looking at case logs, particularly a proceduralist or, a surgical specialist. And they come up with all kind of crazy reasons why they should or should not be granted privileges. And Scheinbart, you're going to have to call them and have this conversation, maybe the withdrawal, before the excitement and all the fireworks and stuff. And I said to myself, why are we credentialing people this way? Why aren't we doing it on outcomes? Why don't we get what? Maybe you did, I didn't. We didn't have that, but there ought to be a national consideration that as we move towards outcome-based healthcare delivery, not value, outcome. What's your, how many times have you injured the kidney with your coronary catheterization? With your dye load, how much dye do you use on it? How many times have you had to transfuse? We have national standards by which people conduct the care of patients. Now, I know the argument, because the argument is all about length of stay and age caps. It's not my fault they're there for 5 or 6 days. It's not my fault that the communication with physician score is at this percentile. It's all those other consultants. Well, who ordered all those other bad consultants to lower your age cap score or prolong their length of stay? So, that the staff in the cath lab let too much dye go in every time I was doing my LV gram. But you ordered 4 LV grams all at once. Like, really? So what do you think about that if we had the magic wand?
Well, I think it's a terrific point. When peer review is all around complaints rather than objective outcome measurements, you're in a sort of a shaky category. So I think the problem with outcomes historically has been just having the data. And, and then people want to argue about the acuity of their patients and, is it
I
fair?
have the sickest
You know,
patients. I always did.
right.
Always.
But we're getting better at it. Our
Yeah.
data is getting better. And as we've moved into the electronic health records, our ability to really do apples to apples comparison is much better today than it was even a decade or two ago. So I think that's well said, that we need to be sort of focused in that area on the outcomes. Um, so it's a work in progress, I think.
Yeah, no, I think that's critically important what you just said. And thank you for helping me remind myself that the glass is half full, not half empty. That there ought to be ways through new technology and all for the right reasons. So remember when the EHR came out in the 90s, when we stopped going to the hospital and we had hospitalists do everything for us, right? We thought this would be great. At least I did. I bet you did too. We're going to collect all this data, and this data that goes into this electronic record is going to make us better at what we do. You're smiling. Does this ring true?
Oh yeah, right.
And of course, it became a documentation machine for the purposes of coding and billing and compliance. It had nothing to do with better patient care. And it may not even, but I think it's transitioning to your point. We should be getting better at grabbing that data and understanding the apples to apples, that no, this was your hand that dealt that card that day. This was not somebody else's issue. And that attribution, whether we're timing this or measuring that or looking at a rate or looking at a rule, that was on you, because we've been able to extract all the variables, so you can't say that person was sick, or the staff didn't do what you wanted in a timely manner. And that would be an ideal state. And if systems are really, really committed to quality and safety, that they will look at their vendors and their software to create those dashboards. That would be value by the CMO for the patient. The last question, and you may have just touched on it, or maybe you have another idea, and what is the biggest fire in healthcare today, and what can a chief medical officer do about that? Whether you want to continue to talk about vertical integration or inertia, or consensus building, or there's another fire in mind on how a chief medical officer might approach that.
Yeah. Uh, Plenty of fires to talk about, as you're aware. I think for me, healthcare has a math problem, and our expenses are going up at 6 to 8%, and our revenue is going up at 3%. And those curves are going further and further apart. And most healthcare systems are trying to make ends meet by being leaner and removing administrative overhead, or trying to sort of build some of their volume. And they're trying to sort of make ends meet. But at the end of the day, right now, there's just a tremendous amount of financial pressure on healthcare organizations. So, as a chief medical officer, you're trying to do process improvement, good peer review, utilization review. All those take individuals and people. And as the staff gets shrunk because we're trying to hit the budget targets, it's just harder and harder to do that work. So, I worry about where healthcare is going, because there's only so much efficiency you can get out of the system. And most health systems have already done rounds of layoffs, and they're trying to be as lean as they can. But when you look at our expense side, whether it's durable goods or labor or pharma, those are going up faster than our reimbursement is. And so the screws are getting tightened on healthcare right now. And it makes it really hard to do the process improvement work that I think drew you and me into these leadership roles, because we want to make things better. So I don't know. That's the one I lose the most sleep over, because I don't see an obvious solution for this.
Well, nor do I, although I have some thoughts that I will bring forth at a later date. I think that you indicate that a chief medical officer brings a lot of value to their health system, their hospital, their clinic. And if we have a math problem, as you indicate, and I agree, that's where the chief medical officer's value goes up, because they can continue for the foreseeable future working through some of that waste and inefficiency to keep the math working until other opportunities come along. And I do see some calculus involved where I think this is all going, and I worry too, because I worry about where that money is coming from and what it's intended to do. I think the era, for example, of private equity is probably on its last legs when it comes to healthcare. They've squeezed everything they can squeeze, and I'm sure there's still places they can do it, but I don't think that's the savior of it from a math problem. I think they may actually have the dollars to reinvent how healthcare is delivered. Again, maybe to somebody's benefit, but ultimately to the care of the patient. So maybe I should say private equity 1.0 or maybe 2.0 is passing, and we'll see what happens next. Not to mention the federal side of it. Well, look, this has been a great episode, and I appreciate all of your answers. And I'm going to wrap it up with the following. And I'm going to ask you if you agree or disagree or have a different way of looking at it. But being a chief medical officer, in my opinion, is no small task, and it takes intentional preparation, even if you and I didn't have it when we had it, although most of it feels like a trial by fire. And my old boss, he told me it is just like a career in firefighting. You go to medical school, you go to firefighting school, you train, you drill, And then you're ready to do something, either take care of a patient or put out a fire. You put on the uniform, you put on the white coat, you put on the uniform, you're a fireman. And then one day somebody says, oh, you're a chief resident, or you're the squad leader of the firehouse, or the captain of the house. And then perhaps you're becoming a fire chief one day. And my boss always told me you can never be a good fire chief without first becoming a firefighter. So the question is, what do you think of that?
Well, I think that's true, and I worry about folks that feel like they can lead large healthcare organizations that have always been on the administrative side. I think when I look over the folks I would consider as mentors and some of the folks I really look up to, they were clinicians first, and then they had this drive to want to make things better, and that's how their career moved. Um, into more administrative areas. So I'm a big fan of a physician leadership model because again, I think they've been the frontline firefighters and now they're trying to figure out how do we take care of the whole force.
I like the way you're framing that, because maybe while anybody can say 2 + 2 = 4, today it's 2 + 2 = -3, and physicians may be able to find that extra 2 to bring it back to a -1 or a 1. So because we've lived it, felt it, know the tools, know the skills, and so on and so forth. Well, it has been an amazing pleasure to have you on the show, Doug. I appreciate everything you've said. You've been listening to the Fire Chief podcast with us, the only podcast dedicated to the CMO. If you want to learn more about what it is like to be a CMO, if you want to be on the show, email me at leescheinbart@gmail.com or connect with me on LinkedIn. You can listen to the podcast on Apple, and you can also watch the videos of the shows on YouTube. The show's website is thefirechief.podbean.com. I love talking with CMOs from all over the United States, so please connect, leave your reviews and your comments, and please share this with your colleagues. And in the words of Sergeant Phil Esterhaus, let's be careful out there.